Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Orion's 6th webinar is today going to be presented by Neta Zach, PhD, MPA. She's the Chief Science Officer at Prize for Life. The topic today is ALS patients being proactive. Can ALS big data bring the next ALS breakthrough? Neta is the Chief Scientific Officer at Prize for Life Israel and managed all of its programmatic portfolio, including the PRO-ACT database, an award-winning, largest of its kind database of ALS patients from past clinical trials, the ALS Prediction Prize, the ALS Gene of ALS Genetic Information, and the ALS Forum of ALS News and other programs. Dr. Zach has been with Prize for Life since 2011. Prior to joining it at Prize for Life, she was a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. She earned her PhD in computational neuroscience from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel, and her MPA from the University of Pennsylvania. She completed her postdoctoral work at the Rockefeller University under a Fulbright scholarship. Before her career in research, she won a silver medal in the all-around competition in the artistic gymnastics of the Sydney Olympics. She paid me to say that, and is also one of the top 10 Scrabble players in the world in 3 separate languages. So folks, don't forget the Q&A. It's the blue button on the left. You can type in your questions at any time, and at about 1/4 after her presentation, Neta will be happy to answer all inquiries. So ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the presentation. Dr. Neta Zach.
Thank you, Lenny. And first I want to say thank you to Orion for organizing this webinar, and even more so for their great dedication to promoting research and combined computational research in complex fields like ALS. So as Lenny said, I'm Dr. Zach. I work with Prize for Life. And just a little overview, I'm going to first say a little bit about who we are. But really the bigger topic of this conversation is big data and the involvement of big data in rare diseases. And I'm going to talk about 2 examples or case studies for the use of big data for promoting research on rare diseases. 2 case studies that we've been involved with. One is the PRO-ACT database, and the other is the ALS Prediction Prize. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the lessons from it and the lessons for other diseases. So who are we? Prize for Life is an organization focused exclusively on the acceleration of the development of treatments and a cure for ALS. ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig disease or motor neuron disease, is a disease that affects the motor neurons that control the muscles and control voluntary movements, which mean that as these muscles deteriorate, the patient becomes weaker and more progressively paralyzed, until eventually ALS leads to death within approximately 3 to 5 years from disease onset, and is 100% fatal. So 100% fatal, relatively fast death, and before that, complete paralysis, so it has a tremendous burden on the patient life. And contrary to other neurodegenerative disease, it's also not a disease associated with aging in any way. The median age for disease onset is about 50, and we see patients with a range between the age of 20 or even less than 20 until really later age. In the picture you see an example of a patient, which is one of the managers of Prize for Life, which is a patient-managed organization. His name is Shai, and you see him with his son. Shai was diagnosed at the age of 47. You see him here about 1.5 or 2 years after disease onset. Just to clarify the progression of the disease, about 6 months after disease onset, he completed an Ironman competition, and he won third place for his age category. So he moved within 1.5 years from winning an Ironman competition to being completely paralyzed. This is how ALS typically looks. And ALS, because it's such a really devastating disease, we, Prize for Life, are committed to doing everything we can to solve it, and really going beyond typical models of promoting research and figuring out what is the most effective way that a small patient-based organization can really lead to a breakthrough in research. And the reason for that is that we ourselves are patient-based. So Prize for Life was founded by an ALS patient, Avi Kramer, who you can see here. So this is Avi 9 months after diagnosis. When he was diagnosed, he was a MBA student at Harvard Business School, and he was 29. And as a Harvard Business School student, the world was his oyster. And suddenly he discovered that he has, on average, 3 to 5 years to live. And he decided to really use everything that he learned at Harvard Business School, all of the information, all of the connections, all of the motivation, and really put them into accelerating treatment for ALS. So really going beyond and finding what is the most effective ways to really make a difference. And the way we go about it is that we think the thing that is most needed for ALS treatment is really new ideas and new minds, going beyond this framework of a small, rare disease that is only researched by very few specialized people. And in a way, the way Shai says it, to go back to Shai, the way Shai says it is that a victory over ALS is not something that one person can do alone. And it's important that everyone would find what is their part in victory over ALS. So really, we want to think how we could bring new people into this field. And the way we do it is that we want to identify the barriers currently preventing the development of effective treatments for ALS. And for each one of these barriers, we develop a prize program that defines for the community a solution that is needed for this barrier, and invite people to solve it together. And we use this prize model to solve different barriers in different fields, so we're not limited to one type of research. And really, we've seen, and I'm going to give you an example in this talk, we've seen a tremendous growth in the different type of research being made on ALS. And we think that through this amount of people together, we will be able to make a breakthrough in ALS. And indeed, you can see here in the picture, Avi receiving the Israeli Prime Minister Award for innovation and entrepreneurship for a nonprofit because of this innovation. So to go back to our broader topic of big data and rare diseases, then really one of the most limiting factors in understanding rare diseases like ALS and other diseases is the scarcity of data. So sadly, rare diseases are as diverse and complex as very common diseases like cancer or diabetes. But in addition to the complexity, they're also rare. So there's really scarcity of data. Every clinician only sees so-and-so patient. Every clinic only gathers so-and-so amount of data. And this really creates a tremendous burden in our ability to make meaningful observations about these diseases. Now, recently, in all diseases, including rare diseases, we really see that big data has created a tremendous transformation. So technological improvement now allow processing, standardization, and storage of much bigger data sets that were ever available before for research. There are examples from that, of course, from genetic databases. We also seen for example, clinical database aggregates. For example, a recent work on health records, previous health records, also non-disease data monitored during the patient's regular life. So all of this, we think, is very hopeful for rare diseases. And we ask ourselves, or we think that this is our responsibility to ask ourselves, what can be done more? And the answer is that we need better data, more diverse data sources to bring together to understand diseases. This is generally a goal that we share with Orion. We also need more collaborations on these data sources, and for that, more availability of open access data to allow more collaborations. And we need more research and more researchers engaged in rare diseases. So now it's really our biggest question, and the biggest question that really all ALS patients that we meet ask us: what can one patient or a few patient or a small patient-based organization, what can we do to promote research? And the answer for that is that we want to tackle each one of these problems. So we want to identify data sources, we want to foster collaboration, and we want to foster more research and bring in more researchers. And I'm going to give examples in my talk for all of these three topics. So the first case study is really how to foster collaboration and how to bring more data. And this is the PRO-ACT database. So the PRO-ACT database is the pooled resource, open access ALS clinical trial database, available at alsdatabase.org. So I'm going to say this again because it's very important that you remember, www.alsdatabase.org. It was created in partnership with Northeast ALS Consortium, or NEALS, and with the Neurological Clinical Research Institute at MGH, and it was funded by the ALS Therapy Alliance. So what is the PRO-ACT database, or what were the goals of this project? We really thought that one of the things that was the most missing or the biggest sources of unutilized data for ALS was clinical trials. So sadly, there were many failed clinical trials in ALS. There isn't any successful treatment, but there were many attempts. But as these attempts failed, the data was waiting on the shelf, unused. And what we really wanted to do is to bring this data together from the drug companies and find, despite the fact that the treatment was failed, find new ways to utilize it and make important meaning out of it. So for that, we needed to clean and harmonize and aggregate this data, and we need to make it, when it's anonymized and ready, to make it available for the research community and enable both scientists and clinicians to research it. So this was not a small initiative. First, we had to identify all the relevant trials and approach the companies. So we identified 27 trials, and we approached the companies and received 17 trials. And I already want to go ahead of myself and say that there are 17 trials now in PRO-ACT, but we already have agreements for other trials that will be added in the future. Then we had to really catalogize all of this data, organize it, create common data structure, clean and merge the data into a unified framework. But the outcome of this was really the largest ALS clinical database ever, and probably the largest ALS database, period, ever, with 8,635 patients and more to be added in the future. So just to explain this more, there are currently in the United States about 30,000 patients. So this database has an information for about 35% of the patient alive in the United States today. So this is the wealth of the data that we have available. And it's over 8 million data points. And probably the closest database available has about 10% of that. So the largest ALS database available, and what is in it is the type of data that is typically collected in a clinical trial. So we have demographic information, we have clinical information, so the different parameters set to evaluate the patient progression and the patient symptoms, family history, both of ALS and of other diseases, various functional measures such as breathing capacity and so on, vital signs and lab data. Now, I want to say that this is what is currently measured in an ALS clinical trial, and the reason that I want to say that again is because this means that whatever algorithm or whatever tools can be generated from this database, it means that they can very easily be implemented to clinical trials and to clinics all over the world relatively easily and cheaply. So this makes this data very meaningful. The type of data that isn't in it, such as genetics data or other biological or molecular data, would be great. And I think ideally it would be great if to have really a partnership. Orion and ourselves would have a partnership to add to this data other data and investigate it together. But clinical data alone can also mean tremendously important thing for ALS research. And indeed, we won the BioIT World Best Practices Award for this database. But of course, the most important thing is not the amount of data in this database, but the amount of researchers. So the most important thing is who is going to research it and what they're going to do. And given this really unique opportunity of having a large database, so over 8,500 patients, so the largest ALS database and large even in standards of non-rare diseases, we're very lucky to be able to attract many researchers all over the world. Over 350 researchers have already requested the PRO-ACT database. About 60% of them are PhD or MDs. Others, we have also research students working on it. And importantly for us, we see that 21 pharmaceutical companies have requested the data, meaning that at least 21 pharmaceutical companies are working on ALS, which is very significant for us. And also 24 informatics companies have requested the data, a lot of them working jointly with pharmaceutical companies. In addition, we also see that many academic institutions have requested and are working on PRO-ACT. So what type of things can the PRO-ACT database address? So there are more basic queries. For example, the PRO-ACT database can be very instrumental in serving as historical controls, meaning that drug companies can use it to identify the most basic questions about how their ALS patient in their clinical trials are likely to look like. For a rare disease like ALS, this is not clear, has not been clear until the PRO-ACT database. So how many males versus females, what are the basic characteristics of this patient, how long are they expected to live with the disease, all of these very basic questions that really are needed to plan the clinical trials, the PRO-ACT database is able to address potentially for the first time. But it's also able to address much more complex questions about very important for understanding the disease. For example, it allows understanding the natural history and the heterogeneity of the disease, which, as I say, is as diverse as cancer or diabetes, but also rare. It also allows stratification of the patient into different subgroups. So just to give an example, the two most famous ALS patients in the world are Lou Gehrig, who was an ALS patient and died less than 2 years after diagnosis. The second one is Stephen Hawking, who has been alive with the disease for the last 50 years. So this is how diverse ALS is. So maybe with enough data, we can stratify the patient into meaningful subpopulation and tell a future patient whether he's likely to be a Lou Gehrig or a Stephen Hawking, which would make a tremendous difference for the patients. Also looking at comorbidities, drugs, and lab tests, we can identify pathway of the disease and novel biomarkers of the disease, which can help drug development. Looking at mass amounts of information, we can also look at disease progression. I'm going to talk about this later. We can also simulate clinical trials and decide on better outcomes for clinical trials. So all of these kind of questions we see people working on right now. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of the type of questions that PRO-ACT allow sometimes really for the first time for ALS research. And I'm going to give you a few examples. So one example of things that have already been learned from PRO-ACT. So one example is really looking at different predictors of survival. So there have been reports in the literature made on smaller data sets, and sometimes because of that leading to controversy in the literature, and the PROACT database was able to verify these reports and clarify the controversy. So for example, it was able to show the effects of age of onset. So the younger patients have a longer survival than older patients. Site of onset, so some patients have site of onset in the limbs, and others have a bulbar onset, meaning onset in the mouth. So these would be the areas to first deteriorate. And we were able to show the limb onset really has a longer, better survival chances than bulbar onset. And another interesting and maybe counterintuitive discovery is the effect of body mass index or weight. So obese people actually have a better survival chances for ALS, and that is because ALS has a weight loss aspect to it, somewhat like you see in cancer patients. And therefore, to have excess body weight at disease onset is able to protect you. But if you think of a patient like Avi or Shai, so you can see that they both have early age of onset and limb onset. So both of these are protective factors that suggest longer survival. On the other hand, they were slim, so that might hurt their survival. So these sorts of considerations are very meaningful for clinicians discussing with the patients, but these are more preliminary analysis and doesn't allow full understanding of the disease. So we move to more complex analysis. For example, a preliminary attempt to stratify the patient into different subpopulations. So we use clustering analysis to identify a discrete subpopulation of patients. And you can see here 16 discrete subpopulations. Not only are they different in the speed of progression, but they're also different in the type of slope. So we see patients that at some point in the disease plateau and stop progressing for a long time, and really further understanding that and being able to tell which patients are going to progress fast and which are going to plateau is a very important question for the future. And then moving on to even more complex analysis, we can see an analysis like this that was done by Roberto Gomani that really tries to go even further and develop a model to predict which patients are going to be slow progressors and which patients are going to be fast progressors. So just categorizing the patient into slow and fast and being able to predict how well they fall into these categories is very important, both for clinicians and for planning clinical trials. So if to summarize the sort of benefits that the PROACT database can have for ALS R&D, then generally for scientific benefits, we can talk about understanding the natural history and the disease heterogeneity. And we can also talk about understanding disease pathways and novel biomarkers, which, as I said, would be greatly improved by access to more data and more complex analysis, which is something we're now exploring with Orion together. There are also clinical development benefits that are very important for us to accelerate development of treatment. So you can simulate clinical trials, you can test different stratification theories. All of this will allow you to reduce the cost of future clinical trials, which is, of course, very important to drug companies, and also look at current medications and their relation to disease progression and maybe identify interesting connection and potential medications. More broadly, and this is maybe a general message, what the PROACT database with the 350 researchers that are already using it, what it allows us to do is to grow the amount of researchers working on ALS, or to bring new minds into the ALS research. There has been a lot of work on machine learning in bioinformatics and in medical informatics, but not so much in ALS because of the scarcity of data. And a database like PROACT really allows bringing all of these minds and techniques and ideas into ALS and hopefully transforming it. which really leads me to my next case, which is how to promote research. So we really wanted to define a problem for the research community that the PRO-ACT database can help solve. And the problem we wanted to fixate on first was predicting ALS progression. And for that, we launched the ALS Prediction Prize. We did it with collaboration with the DREAM project that runs bioinformatic challenges, and also with the incentive platforms, and with the sponsorship of Nature and The Economist. And the idea of this challenge was to really bring bright minds from all over the world and work together to develop a predictive algorithm that predicts disease progression for a prize of $50,000. So why did we choose disease progression? The idea of the disease progression is something that really is twofold. On one hand, it can really help clinicians because right now they have very limited tools in predicting how a patient is going to progress. As I said, a patient could be Lou Gehrig and died within less than 2 years, or it can be Stephen Hawking and live for decades. And a clinician right now have very limited ability to tell the patient what's going to happen, and also very limited ability to guide them practically to the use of assistive technology and other assistive devices that could really transform the patient life, because the clinician doesn't have any tools to know when the patient is going to need them. So predicting disease progression better is something very meaningful in clinical practice, and it will also enable identifying predictive factors for disease progression. But even going beyond that, it cannot only help the clinicians, but it can really change the future for the patients themselves. And the reason for that is that the more reliable disease progression, the better our ability to conduct clinical trials. So if the clinicians can tell the patient how fast they're going to progress, this means that also in the clinical trials, we have no idea how the patient would have progressed without the treatment. And as we're dividing patient into a placebo and treatment group, we have no idea how these patients are going to respond to placebo or treatment. And it potentially could be, and unfortunately, it's what we have seen in several recent trials, we might end up with slower progressing patient in the placebo group, which could fail the clinical trial and mean that patients are not receiving the treatment. The treatment that could really help them is not making it to the market. So to this heterogeneity, we might be losing treatment, so we might have disastrous catastrophe. The catastrophe of a failed clinical trial for a treatment is actually effective. And also, just to be more certain about how the patient is going to perform, we need much bigger clinical trials with many patients. And that, of course, makes the clinical trials more expensive and more laborious. And if we were able to predict disease progression, we could use fewer patients to plan and execute a clinical trial, and that could mean tremendous cost saving and really for a more accurate trial. So that could really mean that more companies would enter this field, more clinical trials would be made, and more treatments would enter the market. So with this in mind, we started the ALS Prediction Prize, and what the patient needed to do is really use the PRO-ACT database, and we gave the patient a training set to develop their algorithm on, and they could also test it on a separate test. So they could give the algorithm to us, and we tested on a separate set that was available on a leaderboard, so they could see how they perform relative to others. But all of this was during the challenge, and very importantly for us, the final validation was done separately and only once. So the patient developed an algorithm that had to, on a completely separate data set, use 3 months of patient information to predict how the patient are going to look like at the end of the year, so 9 months later, at the end of 12 months. So they had to predict the slope of change between 3 months and the end of the year. And then we separately from the solvers compared this performance to the actual progression of the patient and determined how they actually performed and who was the best algorithm. We were very lucky with the ALS Prediction Prize. It brought a lot of patients. It brought over 1,000 solvers from 64 countries all over the world. And importantly, we also saw that about over 80% of the patients, we surveyed them, said that they didn't have any prior knowledge about ALS. So on a score of 1 to 5, under knowledge about ALS, they chose 1, no knowledge about ALS. So it was very effective in bringing new people into the ALS research. Also importantly for us, we saw that 93% indicated they would have done it again even without a prize. And from the top solvers, we see that at least 3 out of the 5 top solvers are still working on ALS. So the prize was very successful in bringing new people into this field and new ideas. But we don't only need new ideas, we only need new solutions. So I just want to give you a little example of how difficult it is to predict. So what the patient needed, what the solvers needed to predict is a score called ALS Functional Rating Scale, or ALS-FRS. And ALS-FRS is a score that looks like this. So the clinician asked the patient 10 questions about daily activities. So how well can you speak? How well can you breathe? How well can you salivate and swallow? Each one of these questions get a score between 0 and 4, 4 being completely normal and 0 being complete inability. So overall, there's a 0 to 40 score that is the patient status. Now, a slow progressing patient would lose between 0 and 3 points per year. A fast progressing patient would lose something like 20. How it looks like in a patient, so there's an example from Avi when he was still early in his disease. He was dating a woman, and she had an internship, and she was away for a month. And as he said, by the end of the month, I will lose a capacity. I don't know which, but one of them. By the time she comes back, I might not be able to write. I might not be able to walk. I might not be able to dress myself. I don't know what, but something I will lose by the time that she's back. So this is kind of what is the normal ALS progression and how it looks in the ALS-FRS. So this is an example of one patient. And now I'm going to put you as the algorithm developer or the clinicians. So you have a 69-year-old Caucasian female, and she has Bulbar Onset, meaning onset in the mouth. She has the disease for 19 months. Her weight is stable and normal. And you can see that she deteriorates in some functions. She still is very stable in other functions. And you can also look at other data for her. So you can see her respiratory rate and pulse. Her blood pressure seems a little abnormal. Her glucose level seems a little abnormal. Maybe her cholesterol is a little abnormal. But this is the sort of information that you have as a clinician. So it's not a lot to work with, especially as you can see, most lab tests look fine, and blood tests of cholesterol might well be unrelated. So really, this is for a clinician to tell if this patient is going to be a fast or a slow progression. You really don't have anything to work with. You're going to measure it by the slightly high cholesterol. So this is a job very befitting for a machine learning algorithm that can really comb through a large amount of data and find very small correlation and add them together to develop a model that is sensitive enough to look through this type of information. And indeed, we saw that the algorithm that won were significantly better than clinicians. So going to the winners, we had 2 winners, 2 teams. One of them were 2 researchers from Stanford, and the other was a marketing analytics company from Washington, D.C. called Centrana. And what we did is we tried to compare the performance of the winning algorithms to the performance of clinicians. So we took sample cases and we fed them to both the algorithm and the clinicians. And so this is one of the sample cases. And both had to predict how is this woman going to look like a year from now. And we measure two things. One of them is the correlation between what they predicted and how the patients actually performed. And the other one is RMSD, root mean square of deviation, which is the difference between the prediction and the actual score. So you want a very high correlation and a very low difference. So these would be better results, so higher correlation and lower RMSD. And indeed, we saw that the methods outperform all of the 12 clinicians. They didn't only outperform them on average, they actually outperformed them on each and every single patient. So the algorithms were able to predict progression much better than the clinicians. And the clinician also said that based on just rudimentary data, it's almost impossible for a clinician to predict progression. But for an algorithm, it's very possible. Also, as I said, it's very important to see if you have this prediction, what would be the impact of that on clinical trial. And so we simulated a clinical trial as would be done regularly to assess the number of patients needed. And with the help of the algorithm, we found that 23% fewer patients were needed in order to see an effect of a drug. So a clinical trial using one of the winning solutions would need 23% less patients in order to start the trial. So the most conservative measure of what would be the cost reduction of 23% fewer patients, if you just take the cost per patient and you don't calculate other costs that depend on the scale of the trial, only that alone is a $6 million reduction in the amount of money that each and every company running a clinical trial would have to spend. So with a $50,000 challenge, we were able to create tools that will reduce $6 million at least for every future clinical trial. Also, another important thing is that if you use novel machine learning algorithms, the algorithms that won the challenge, one of them was random forest, and the other was BART, which is a Bayesian machine learning algorithm. So they're also able to identify novel predictive features that sometimes are very slightly but consistently predictive. And that is something that the human eye is very unsensitive to, but algorithms can pick up. So we were able to identify different predictors. Some of them are known predictors, such as weight that we talked about, or age that we talked about. But importantly, we're also able to identify novel features, interestingly, features such as blood pressure and pulse that were not identified before in the literature, and also a blood test of creatinine that has been suggested in other neurodegenerative diseases and is actually now being investigated as a potential biomarker for ALS. So it also brought us new research ideas and research pathways to look at. Now, the challenge was very successful, but it's not the end. If the proof of the pudding is in the eating, the proof of the algorithms is in the clinical benefits that they bring. The challenge created an algorithms that are available for the clinical community, but they're not readily available. We still need to make sure that these algorithms get to be used by clinicians that can use them to predict the future for ALS patients in their clinics, that they get to clinical trial managers that use them for cost saving for future trials, that companies are aware that they have this cost saving device and going to start looking at ALS research for the first time. So this is our real mission, to take it all the way until we see not only an algorithm, not only a cheaper trial, but until we see a treatment. Now, for this I have a very happy example. So what do you need to do to take these algorithms all the way? First of all, it's very important that you go beyond the type of data in the challenge. They try different diverse data types. The type of data that are available in the clinic are sometimes more limited compared to a clinical trial. And in that, we were very lucky, in which Centrana, one of the two winners, decided to really continue with their algorithm, and they created a company called Orion Data Science. And Orion further developed their model. So their model was good enough to win the ALS Prediction Prize, but they have since improved it further using, as I said, more diverse data types, and also improving the algorithm themselves so that it's 14% better now than it was before. And just so you'd see the quality of prediction that they have now, this is an example on 222 patients. So this is the ALS-FRS predicted by their algorithm, and this is the actual score. And they already have a correlation of 0.87, so a very high correlation and a very close to 1 slope. So the algorithm is even better now at predicting disease progression. Another way to assess the quality of the algorithm is to really look at the difference between actual and predicted over the entire population. So the closer the algorithm is to the actual scores, this algorithm should be around 0. So as a group, it should predict the population accurately. And indeed, this algorithm is really as close to 0 as possible. So the difference is 0.04. So as a whole, it predicts the patient correctly. Another thing is important to test is not only how it predicts on a group, but how it predicts on the individual level case. And in that case, you want to look at the variance or the standard deviation of this histogram of differences. So for this patient, the algorithm predicted exactly correctly, so the difference was 0. But for example, for this patient, the difference was a little larger, and for this patient, the difference was a little larger. So you want to look at the standard deviation to understand how correctly does the algorithm predict for an individual patient. And you really see that the standard deviation is about 3 points out of 40. So the algorithm predicts correctly for the individual patient at about 10 up to about 90% accuracy. So again, we're going back to similar to the correlation. So very close to perfect prediction. You can never have a perfect condition. And indeed, Orion is now working on partnering with both clinicians and pharmaceutical companies to bring this model into the clinics, into clinical trials, and accelerate treatment of a future drug or a cure, a treatment or a cure for ALS. So to really summarize it, I want to go back to the general point of big data and rare diseases. And I want to give you the PRO-ACT database as an example that pooling clinical trial data or other types of data, but pooling large amount of data, can really enable answer new questions and gain new insights into diseases. And this is especially important for rare diseases in which data is really the key missing factors. We really don't understand these diseases, and we need big data. Another benefit is that it really can, if you bring a lot of data, if you bring it, they would come. So we see that a lot of new researchers have started working on ALS just because the availability of the data that was not available before. And this really brought a lot of new techniques, a lot of new ideas into this field, and I think it could do wonder for other rare diseases as well. Looking at something like the ALS Prediction Prize, we really see the success of crowdsourcing, and we really see the ability to promote research. It enables bringing new people and developing predictive algorithms really well beyond what was available before, and really enabled already a breakthrough that is meaningful both for clinical practice, both for improving disease understanding, and for reducing the cost of future clinical trials. All of this was, of course, a joint effort. So a lot of people from Prize for Life, also a lot of people from the Neurological Clinical Research Institute. Without them, there would be no PRO-ACT database. Also, a lot of people work together for the ALS Prediction Prize, both in DREAM and in other places. And all of this would never happen without the support of the Northeast ALS Consortium and the ALS Therapy Alliance. So it took a lot of people, and it took, more importantly, a lot of researchers, a lot of ideas, but all of this, I believe, was worth it, because it's really, this is how you get the next breakthrough. So if you want to look at the PRO-ACT database, it's www.alsdatabase.org. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Hi, Neta. Thank you, Jeremy.
Hello.
I think some questions come in. I had a couple myself, and I was curious if there's any common disease pathways with other CNS disorders or degenerative diseases that you can use to bolster the ALS database, or if there's any plan to synergize some of these disease pathways.
What we're working on now is really to understand comorbidities, comorbidities in the patient population, to really understand what diseases would make sense to collaborate with. Another way to collaborate is really in the tools. A lot of people that have been working on the PRO-ACT database have never worked on any health-related database before, and we've helped them also utilize these tools in other CNS disease, also in cancer. So I think also the growing of analytical tools for health databases, for clinical database, can mean a lot for all diseases together, not just for ALS.
Great, thank you. And I was also curious if a lot of the industry institutions and research institutions that are accessing the database and running their own projects, are they identifying any potential drug targets, or are they sharing that with Prize for Life? Or I'm not sure if you can speak to that necessarily.
So first of all, we require researchers to submit a research proposal in order to use the PRO-ACT database, but we don't require them to share with us the results. So they can do it confidentially if they choose to. We did see from our interaction with pharmaceutical companies that a lot of them are using it to investigate new ideas for their preclinical development as well. Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't see any in the chat feature. If people that are viewing, if they have a question, they can submit it through the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of their screen.
Here is a question from Magali. Do you see it, Neta?
Would molecular data enhance your diagnostic prognostics? Definitely, it would. So currently, we don't have any molecular data because molecular data isn't currently being collected in clinical trials. I think this is a chicken and an egg problem, that the reason it isn't collected is because there's not enough data on it to understand how important it is. So if we'd had a combination of clinical and molecular data, this would be a tremendous resource and would allow to really identify more prognostic factors, and then more people would also look at it. I see there's also a question, are patients likely to share genetic DNA and RNA and other data? So we've been working on partnerships about molecular and genetics data. And generally, as patient-oriented group, we're working with a lot of patients, and Patients are very happy to ALS patients are very happy to participate in research. The patients have never been a problem for ALS, not for trial recruitment, not for research recruitment. It's a devastating disease, and they're very happy to help. We have never had any issues. So definitely the patient would be very happy to share genetic information, and the only thing that's stopping it is the limited understanding of how much can be derived, how many important insights can be derived from that database. Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't see any additional audience questions. Lenny, do you have any on your end that you see?
I do not see any either. I'll ask you a question though. Where do you see your organization and the research that you're doing in 5 years?
So I would say, first of all, we are growing the PRO-ACT database. So I would say for PRO-ACT database, we see it twice as bigger. There are still many trials out there, and 8,500 patients is a lot, but 15,000 is more. And I think this is a realistic goal in 5 years. But I would say data-wise, we would like to grow and expand to bigger data types. So ideally, in 5 years, there would be enough interest and enough capacity to allow to really have a comprehensive database that includes clinical database, genetic database, molecular database, patient-generated data, and bringing all of this together to really have a comprehensive understanding of how the patient look like in real life, and to that to really accelerate treatment. Even more ideally, I would say as an organization, we always say that our ideal goal is to cease to exist. So the ideal goal that in 5 years there would be a treatment on the market, and they would not need us to accelerate the treatment anymore.
Great. There are several questions now in the queue. Can you see the Q&A?
Yes. Okay. So I'm repeating the question. The score prediction seems to be effective in specificity of prediction, but what about sensitivity? Do you predict slow versus fast equally as well? If there was a positive therapeutic intervention, would you hope to see a predictive effect ahead? So the reason we show the specificity is because it's very important for minimizing the cost of clinical trial. So it's very important that we accurately predict. But the algorithms have been able to predict slow versus fast patient very well. Actually, predicting slow versus fast is easier than predicting the specific slow per patient for the algorithms. So that we were able to see. One idea about the positive therapeutic intervention, then ideally we would hope to see that in advance. So not only would the algorithms allow dividing the patient into treatment and placebo group, but they would also allow to see how the therapeutic effect changes the prediction for the patient progression from what was predicted, and therefore we would be able to see the therapeutic intervention in before time, and maybe could make clinical trials shorter or more or stronger by showing the effect more strongly. Yes. Another question is, how do you see this effort help the validation of new drug targets? So I think some of it I answered before, but just to clarify. So we believe that the algorithms can really help developing and planning the trial, and therefore it can help having cheaper, more trials and more accurate, and it can also help seeing the positive therapeutic intervention by seeing how the patient deviates from how they were expected to progress before they were given the treatment. So it could definitely help with the validation of new drug targets. Yeah, these are the questions I see. Do you have anything else?
There are two other questions. I'll just read one to you. Are you looking into applying this towards familial ALS cases per se?
So the database has both familial and sporadic patients. We did not try to look specifically at familial cases, but I think this is an interesting point to see if there is anything specific about them. Yeah, I think it would be an interesting approach.
And the last one that I see is with respect to the clustering you showed early on, where the cluster is very definitive or more like a continuum with arbitrary boundaries. Could you identify underlying factors that define the clusters?
So this is a very good question. The clustering was preliminary and arbitrary. So we tried to look at different groups, and we were able to see meaningful deviation to 16 groups, but there is nothing specific about these groups. And I would say stratification of patient is very important, and exploring the boundaries is very important to us. This would be a goal for a future challenge, and we plan to have a future challenge specifically about stratification.
Okay, and I do not see any more questions. Oh wait, hang on. Did you address this one? Are the technical details about the winning algorithms available, or are they proprietary?
So the answer is sadly currently neither. So the technical details about the algorithms and the actual code would be available open access with a publication summarizing the prediction algorithm and all of the technical details. It's in publication now, and when it should become available in the publication soon. We definitely hope that everyone will learn it, would read it and learn the technical details, and they can just download the algorithms and use them. So the intention is that the algorithm would be available open access with the publication.
Very good. I see no more questions, and we are just about a minute away from the hour, and so perfect timing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Neta. That was a great presentation. Thanks to everyone for attending. We have not yet scheduled our September webinar, but we will soon. Check back on our website and social media pages for that. So thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Neta, and
Thank you, Annie.
we'll look forward to seeing everyone soon.